organise that. This promises to be, I think, a fabulous series, so I do hope those of you who are here will continue to come. And yes, it's a great number. 20 minutes ago there wasn't anybody in this room. The only other thing I have to say is that some of our speakers this term, 3 in particular, are coming a very, very long way. Elizabeth comes from Somerset. We've got Michelle Brown next week, who's coming from Land's End, and somebody else coming from Lindisfarne later on. If you can contribute towards the travel expenses we will have to meet, I'd be really grateful. But just give what you can. So I think, Elizabeth has a wide experience of Celtic spirituality. She's written several books and they're here. Please do look afterwards. I'm sure if you choose to buy one, she will sign them. What else should I be saying? She has a small house of prayer in Somerset. It sounds as if it's idyllic. So if you're interested in taking a short retreat, please have a word with her afterwards. So, I think we'll begin. St. Patrick and the origins of Celtic spirituality. Let's give her a warm welcome.
Thank you. We've got some seats down the front here. You're on the door. Well, welcome. I'm sorry I'm slightly incapacitated. 5 weeks ago I was picking blackberries in the field at the back of my plot when a horse I didn't know came up and stood on my foot and wouldn't get off. And I was sure I'd be bouncing back, but there's been quite a lot of soft tissue damage, so it's a bit slower. Anyway, so I'm kicking off the series on Celtic Christianity, and I normally find that one of the questions most people have is, how did Celtic Christianity start? And the answer is, Christianity started in the British Isles quite a long time before there was such a thing as Celtic Christianity. Because Britain was, except for Ireland, a Roman colony or a Roman occupied territory, or whatever you like to call it. Britain was thoroughly Romanised and had been since the time of Christ. And in 313 AD, the Emperor Constantine became Christian, which means that the whole Roman Empire suddenly, therefore, was Christian. Now, the Romans didn't leave Britain for another 100 years. So for 100 years, Britain, excluding Ireland, was Christian simply because it was Roman. And because the Romans brought civilized things like towns within their wake, towns had bishops from the earliest times. So for 100 years in the UK, between 313 AD and 410, when the Romans left, all the towns had bishops, and at that time it was the bishop's job to baptize and to confirm and to ordain. So Christianity was very well established by the time the Romans left. The only problem was that when the Romans did leave, the economy collapsed, so the towns collapsed, which meant that the whole organisational structure of Christianity also gradually decayed. So the bishops had nowhere to operate out of once the towns fell into ruin. But by that time, in Gaul particularly, there had now arisen monasteries, Gallo-Roman monasteries. St. Martin of Tours was a very famous bishop who also set up a monastery. So he led a sort of dual life. He had his bishop's seat in the town of Tours, but then beside the river outside the town, he and some of his friends started living in caves as semi-hermits, meeting together to pray. So he pretty well invented a sort of double life where you could be, your bishop work was what you did in the day, and then you commuted back home to your cave, as did your fellow clergy, and you could have a prayerful retreat. And there were some other well-established monasteries in the south of France, at places like Les Reins, where monks had gone out to the desert mothers and fathers in Egypt and Syria and seen how they were living in their deserts and thought, this is a jolly good idea. We could transpose that sort of lifestyle to meet northern European climatic conditions. We haven't got any deserts. Well, they did down in the south of France a bit. We've got better weather, but we can replicate their lives by living in forests and in caves and beside riverbanks and on islands. So we can try and live like the desert mothers and fathers, sort of on our own, but coming together on Sundays for worship and for a celebratory meal, and with a sort of inbuilt structure of disciples and leaders, holy leaders, both men and women, so that the lifestyle could be learnt and handed on. So in the south of France, some enterprising monks went down to the Egyptian desert to see how it was done. Notably John Cashin in the 380s. And a few enterprising women abbesses did the same thing. So, that one from the north of Spain, who we call a pilgrim, who we say that she actually compiled diaries for her sisters back at home, but really she was doing the same. What's her name? I've forgotten. What's her name? That's right, a theory. Her name's Egeria, that's right, sorry, thank you. So Egeria did not go straight to the Holy Land. She started by going down to the Sinai Desert and seeing how the monks and nuns lived there, and talks about them all, and how a lot of them were very old. They all came out to welcome her and the other pilgrims, except for the very, very old ones, she says. And after she'd been right through the Sinai Desert, then she went to Jerusalem, and in time for Holy Week and for the Holy Week services, and she left terribly important eyewitness accounts of how they were celebrated in the 380s in Jerusalem. But she too was one of these intrepid monastics who went down to the desert to see how it was done there. So they brought back their ideas and their experience, and John Cashin took about 20 years to mull over what he'd seen and heard, and then he wrote some guidebooks on how to do it in Northern Europe. And these were hugely popular, and these sort of how to do it books spread to Britain and Ireland, and all kinds of new monasteries sprang up, and they all read John Cashin's How to Do It books, which were basically semi-invented dialogues between himself and various holy masters that he met and stayed with, and asking them how to live this life. Also, at the same time, things called collections of the sayings of the desert mothers and fathers were made, and they became popular right through the Middle Ages in Northern Europe as little witty things to remember as to how guidelines about love and charity and compassion and praying and depression and all kinds of things that you would encounter. So, out of all that, Celtic monasteries started in Gaul largely, and from there they spread because the Romans in Gaul travelled a lot to Britain, and so in southeast Wales, which was heavily Romanised, there sprang up first of all some very important British monasteries in the Vale of Glamorgan particularly, and where the Romans had a big fort at Caerleon and a big civil centre at Caerwent. So the Romans there were very Christian, and that is really where Celtic Christianity started. In the Vale of Glamorgan, having spread out from those very Roman towns, Caerwent and Caerleon. And we're told by a few historians, like Bede, that a couple of soldiers in the fortress at Caerleon became Christian just before the time of Constantine, when it was illegal rather than compulsory. And because they refused to venerate the Roman standards which symbolised the Roman gods, the Roman emperor, they were martyred. They were called Julius and Aaron. They would be taken to the civil courts at Caerwent, and both those places are very worthwhile exploring. At Caerwent, the entire Roman wall is still there around what was the town, and in the middle is the church on the site of where a monastery was. And in Caerleon, there's the amphitheatre where the soldiers, including Julius and Aaron, trained, and the Roman barracks where they were billeted. And again, right in the middle is the church named after St. Cadog, again, which was where the post-Roman Christians set up a monastery. Now, it was very handy that by then they had begun to set up monasteries as the towns were declining, because you had all these homeless bishops. So, what did the bishops do? Well, the thing is, dioceses didn't have fixed boundaries, apart from sort of major rivers and mountain ranges. So they were very flexy, the boundaries. So the natural place for the bishop to sort of gravitate to, where he could pray with some other people, would be just like Martin of Tours, to the nearest monastery. So the monasteries were setting up just as the towns were declining. And so sometimes these bishops would be abbots of the new monasteries, but they preferred not to, because they had to go around baptising everyone, because priests didn't yet baptise. It was seen as so important, such a life-changing experience. So the bishops were on the road most of the time. So is that sort of clear so far? Any questions?
The books of Cassian that you talked about.
Yeah.
Were they the precursors to monastic rules?
They were Cassian's conferences, and the actual name derives from the bit that would be read each night at their night liturgy. The rules came a little bit later, once they had lived the life long enough to evolve some patterns. But before they looked at two rules as what to do, they had a bit of a different mindset. And we know this from the monasteries in Ireland. What you would do is you'd go to a monastery and you would, as a visitor, pilgrim, inquirer, candidate, you'd come, you'd be welcomed, and you would see whether you liked the atmosphere, whether you liked the tone of the place, And whether you got on with the abbot and whether you sort of warmed to his style. If you did, you'd stay there. If not, you'd move on and sample the next one. So, much more of an individual flavour, depending on the holiness of the holy man or holy woman who led the community. So it was still much more a disciple, master or mistress relationship. That is how you learned holiness in early times. Then, gradually, the people who became outstanding monastic leaders, which was chiefly Columbanus, sort of at the middle of the Celtic monastic period, he wrote a rule, and others did, and his was the most important, Columbanus, right across Europe, because he then travelled right back across Europe and set up lots of new monasteries, because he was a very charismatic figure. And his was the rule that was used most, until eventually Benedict came along, and the French emperors preferred the Benedictine new sort of more balanced, less rigorous approach, and also Benedictine abbots were much more tied into the political system, so the emperors and kings could have more control over them. So the rule of Benedict gradually, the legislation was you must stop following the rule of Columbanus and become Benedictinized. In about the 6th century, 7th, 8th century, particularly in Gaul.
So that was post-Whitby. That was post the Synod of Whitby, after the Synod of Whitby.
Yeah. Everything was a lot more piecemeal than Bede conveys in his History of the English as a Nation. He designs it all around the centrepiece of the Synod of Whitby, but it was very much the fashion to create your story as a drama. And he did that very deliberately because you always had some intentions behind what you were doing. And his intention actually was, he was trying to call to account the lax Saxon bishops of his clergy of his time. Not the lax Celtic clergy. He wasn't actually concerned with that at all. Because at that time the monasteries of Iona and Lindisfarne were still beacons of light and learning. So Bede sets that as a terribly important thing, like, the Enu equivalent would be the Vatican electing a pope, whereas actually it was really quite Northumbrian, it was quite a northern thing. It was to do with some things of discipline, the style of haircut and the date of Easter. And at that point there were a number of different ways of celebrating Easter, and there was considerable differences from monastery to monastery about who was following the Roman date and who was following the old date anyway. And some of the monasteries were in fact split down the middle as to which they would follow. In fact, on Iona, by the time we will get to Patrick, but these are quite important questions for the whole course, really. On Iona, by the time of the 9th abbot, Adovnorn, he was in a bit of a pickle because he was a progressive and he was following the new date of Easter, the Roman one. Columbanus had been a bit old-fashioned and had written to the Pope saying, that's rubbish, your astronomers and mathematicians are rubbish, we are following the right one. So Adovnorn was in the awkward position that the monks on Iona were following the old Easter, and he could not get them to change to follow the new one. And he was the abbot of the entire Columban family of a lot of other monasteries, some progressive and some conservative. So his solution to this embarrassing situation where his monks wouldn't obey him You couldn't have the monks in the middle of Lent when you were in the middle of Easter or vice versa. His solution was to go off on visitation every year when it got to Lent to some of the more liberal monasteries, which were celebrating according to the new calendar, while the monks of his own monastery were getting on doing their own thing. And you do get a hint of all this in Bede a few chapters later, when Cuthbert has taken over on Lindisfarne, and again, this whole thing rears its head, which day and what they're going to do. And by this time, still about half the monasteries across Britain are following the one calendar and half are following the other. And Bede tells us how Cuthbert resolved this problem on Lindisfarne. So what he did was, every afternoon he called a chapter meeting, and all the progressives and all the conservatives just shouted at each other for quite a while, and then Cuthbert would say, okay, thank you very much, time for tea, and they would go away. And then the next day he called a chapter and again, and they carried on fighting it out, and then he said, thank you very much. And they carried on until they came to a decision. And their decision was, well, they're still keeping it the old way on Iona. There's quite a lot of us here on Lindisfarne that want to follow the new way, so we'll split. So the Conservatives, who were largely sort of, in quotes, the bog Irish element, all went off to Iona. The Liberals, who had more Anglo-Saxon, well-educated people, actually stayed in Lindisfarne, and Cuthbert stayed with them. So the thing did not get sorted at the Synod of Whitby at all. It was part of an ongoing evolution. So you can find that yourself. You won't find about Cuthbert saying, well, time for tea now, but you'll find how he does it in Bede's The History of the English as a Nation. Now, all that is mainland Britain, but there was a slightly different situation in Ireland, moving on ever closer to Patrick, because the Romans never conquered Ireland. So there were no towns, so there were no bishops. So nothing decayed, really, until the Vikings came and set up towns from scratch in Dublin and places like that. However, Romans did know Ireland. Ptolemy in the 2nd century lists the ports of Ireland, so we know there were merchants, Roman merchants, going there and trading. So they must have had people to trade with. We've also, the archaeologists have discovered a big hoard of Roman gold coins in one of the passage graves at Newgrange. So we know that there were soldiers there. So it's quite likely that Irish people went to the continent to serve in the Roman army and then retired. And it's quite likely traders came. And so Christianity would have gone to Ireland, would have arrived there. And we know that there were Christians there well before Patrick, because he tells us so. And not only because he tells us so, but because we know that Palladius was sent, in quotes, to the Christians in Ireland to sort out some of their theology, because some of them were following Pelagius, and the Pope sent Palladius from Auxerre, where he probably worked in southern Ireland, to work among the Christians who were already there. So we know that Patrick did not bring the faith to Ireland, and that was not the beginning of Christianity. We have more of a problem trying to find out, well, we can't find out, when Patrick lived, where he came from, where he went to, and what he did. Because he has written a wonderful, unique autobiography, which is the only surviving autobiography in which a Celtic monastic Christian or Celtic Christian talks about his own conversion and his own call, but there are only two proper names in the entire book. One is he says that he was captured by bandits and ended up on the west somewhere, and he was working near a wood called the Wood of Foclut, F-O-C-L-U-T. Well, we have no idea where that wood is. So that's one proper name. And the only other proper name, and we don't even know whether this is a later insertion, was where he says his father was a deacon, his grandfather was a priest, so in other words, he's from a Romano British Christian family, and they lived in Banavantum Tiberiae, and we have no idea where that is either. So it could be Scotland, it could be Wales, could be Ceredigion, possibly, could be Cornwall. A slightly greater weight of probability favours one of those, but we have no idea. Nor do we have any idea of dates, because he doesn't give us any. Nor do we have any early texts of his biography. I should say two things survive by him. One is his confessions, his biography, and one is the second of two letters that he wrote to a chieftain called Caroticus. And you think, this will help. But no, we don't know. There were a number of Caroticuses, sort of Caraticus is the same word. We don't know whether he was from Ireland or from Scotland or Wales. And it's all too generalised. You'd think, no, this is easy to fix, because Patrick is writing saying some Christians have been captured from Ireland and sold on as slaves to the Picts. And he's writing to Caroticus to say, please, will you organise to get them freed? But slave trading went on right through till the 10th century, round all the British coasts, and was just one of the economic things to do, was capture some people and sell them on. So much so that one of the good works of Christians from very early on was to ransom slaves, and then they could become Christian and become free. So that doesn't really help us. That seemingly promising lead doesn't help either. But the manuscript survives in two illuminated manuscripts written by monks from the 9th century and the 10th century, and those are quoted by a 7th century Irish biographer of Patrick called Muirhew. And so if he's quoting from those two, at least we can get an idea that we're at least on the right track. And if we could posit that Patrick lived in the 5th century, we're probably right. Could have been early 5th, could have been mid-5th. So his writings is one, that letter which he's writing as an old man, and he describes himself as a bishop. And the other one he's written maybe in his 40s, 50s, we don't know. His confession, which is a lot longer. Now, it's not confession in our understanding of the word confession, like apologise for your wrongdoings. It's the word that is used in the Psalms, the Latin word confessio, I will declare the mighty works of God. So really, in his autobiography, he is declaring the mighty works that God has worked through him. And the mighty works are that through him, a people at the far ends of the earth have heard about the gospel. So in other words, you could say, a missionary. Now, yes, but they didn't understand missionaries in the same way that we do. The way that you understood a missionary was you looked at the texts at the end of the Gospels about the ascension into heaven, where Jesus says, his last words to his followers were, go, baptize, heal the sick, go to the ends of the earth and do so, preach the gospel to the ends of the earth, and I'm with you until the end of time. So the early Christians believed that once they'd gone to the ends of the earth and preached the good news, then the end time would happen and Christ would come again and they'd have finished their job. So Patrick considers that while they haven't gone to where he was taken as a slave, the Mayo and Donegal yet, and that must therefore be the ends of the earth because they believed there was nothing else beyond there. So once he had gone there and preached the good news, the end of the world would come. So his job is, he's like Paul saying, I'm an apostle, born after all the others, and my job is to complete the work, complete God's work on earth, and then the end of the world will come. So that's his context. Now, what we're going to look at are two bits of the confessions. So have a look first at the side which says Patrick's Conversion, page 61. And I've taken them from the best translation is by Tom O'Loughlin. It's published by SPCK and it's only £4.99. And he is one of the chief people, who has shown us that all these early writings, particularly this one, is a tissue of quotations from the Bible. Every phrase is a quotation. So if you look at the bottom, all the notes, see how every phrase, first one is Romans 12:3, next one is John 4:10, next one is see 2 Thessalonians, next one is see Philippians, and every little phrase is a quotation. So they're living from totally inside the Gospels and the Old Testament as well, particularly Daniel, because he was writing about the end time. So I'm going to, since it's being recorded, rather than having one of you read it, if you just follow, and I'll read, starting at 16, which is where Patrick is in Ireland. He's a slave. He's going to be there for 6 years, looking after the flocks of his owner. He either ran away or earned his freedom. We don't know. But after 6 years, he has a vision, and God says, go home to Britain. But not before he has learned how to pray. So it's possible that, even though he came from a Romano-British Christian family, he himself didn't believe until he was on his own, out in the woods of Falkland, praying. So this is his description of his conversion. Then, when I had arrived in Ireland and was looking after flocks the whole time, I prayed frequently each day. And more the love of God and the fear of him grew in me, and my faith was increased, and my spirit enlivened. So much so that I prayed up to 100 times in the day, and almost as often at night. I even remained in the wood and on the mountain to pray. And, come hail, rain or snow, I was up before dawn to pray. And I sensed no evil nor spiritual laziness within. I now understand this. At that time, the Spirit was fervent in me. So that's a very beautiful account, isn't it, of his conversion. It's so natural. He's just out there in creation, loads of time to think, cut off from all his family and friends, and he's touched by the Spirit. And it was there, he goes on, indeed, that one night I heard a voice which said to me, well have you fasted, very soon you are to travel to your homeland. And again, not long after that, I heard a revelation which said to me, behold, your ship is prepared. But the ship was far, perhaps 200 miles away. So maybe the southeast coast of Ireland, if he's in the northwest, around Mayo maybe. I had never been nor knew anybody there, he continues. Shortly after that, I fled the man I had been with for 6 years. At last, I arrived at the ship. I had travelled in the power of God. He directed my path towards good, and I feared nothing. So he's still quite young. He was probably captured as a teenager. You wouldn't capture anyone later than that. And he probably goes home, stays there for quite a while with his folks, and then is quite likely to have gone off to Gaul, to a monastery there, maybe Tours or Les Reins, because there were so few in those days, a Gallo-Roman monastery, become a monk. And he apparently became a bishop, but here it gets rather difficult, because he tells us quite a few times in the confessions that his elders or his colleagues meet and discuss him and won't appoint him to be a bishop because as a 15-year-old he had confessed some sin to a friend who brings it up against him at this meeting or synod and says he's not suitable to be a bishop. And he's quite often talking about all these difficulties about not being accepted by his brother bishops. But by the time in his old age he's written this letter to Cultic, he says that he is a bishop. So at some point all this must have died down and he must have overcome all that. And maybe in his mid-40s heard a call to go back to Ireland to preach. And it's a bit like the call of Samuel. He hears it 3 times and he doesn't really believe it until the 3rd time. And it's on the other side of your sheet. We know that by now he's back with his parents in Britain. After a few years, I was again with my parents in Britain, who welcomed me home as a son. They begged me in good faith after all my adversities to go nowhere else, nor ever leave them again. And of course fully trained monks could easily be hermits, they could live at home, and often their family would then live the same lifestyle with them. So he was maybe doing that. And now here is his first call. It was there, I speak the truth, that I saw a vision of the night. A man named Victoricus, like one from Ireland, coming with innumerable letters. He gave me one of them, and I began to read what was in it. And it said, "The voice of the Irish." And just as I was reading the letters opening, I thought I heard the voices of those who live around the wood of Foclut, which is close to the Western Sea. It was as if they were shouting with one voice, "O holy boy, we beg you to come again and walk among us." And I was broken-hearted and could not read more. Then I woke up. Thank God, after many years, the Lord granted them what they called out for. And now here's his second call. And on another night, either in me or close to me, I do not know, God knows, he's quoting St. Paul here, I heard them using the most learned words, but I could not understand them except what became clear towards the end of the speech. he who gave his life for you, i.e. Christ, he it is who speaks in you. And at that point I woke and was full of joy. But he still doesn't do anything. And then here is the third and final call. And yet again I saw him praying in me, and it was as if I was inside my body, and I heard him over me, that is, over the inner man, and he was praying there powerfully with sighs. And in my excitement and astonishment, I wondered who it could be that was praying in me. But towards the end of the prayer, it became clear that it was the Spirit. Just then I awoke and remembered what was said through the apostle. Likewise, the Spirit helps the weaknesses of our prayers, for we do not know how to pray as we ought. But the Spirit himself intercedes for us with sighs beyond what words can express. So that's his call, and that's what he follows, and he goes to Ireland. Now, we don't really know what happened after that, but we do have the 7th century account of Murchu, who was writing at a time when the bishopric of Armagh was becoming important, and at a time when the dynasty of the O'Neills was also becoming important, and the two were working together, the Bishop of Armagh and the O'Neills, or the Enail Brigade. So Murchu tells us about what Patrick did, which may be based on fact, or it could simply be ecclesiastical propaganda to promote a saint, a new saint, Patrick, as patron, as a very important patron of Armagh, which would therefore be a very important bishopric. And we really have no idea. And Murchu is a very good theologian. So he describes Patrick converting the whole of Ireland in one night, because he converts the chieftain in one night, just like Constantine having become Christian in one night. And it's not any old night, it is Easter night, because Easter night is when pagans become Christians. And he describes it in the context of the runaway Israelite slaves escaping from Egypt on that holy night. Because Easter night was the same as the Exodus night, the Passover night when they fled from darkness to light, from death to life, when they were redeemed. So clever old Murchu puts all these three layers together. Patrick converting the Irish, Easter night, and the escape of the Israelites from Egypt, and this is how he does it. He describes a dramatic confrontation between Patrick and the High King of Ireland, who lived at Tara, 25 miles northwest of Dublin, as is now. And Murchu says Easter that year fell on the same day as the great Celtic fire festival, when every fire had to be extinguished until a new one was lit by the High King's druids on Tara at dawn. However, Patrick gathered his followers on the nearby hill of Slane, 12 miles further north, where a beacon could very easily be seen from by the High King and his magicians on Tara, in order to celebrate the resurrection of Christ by lighting the Easter fire. So the furious king arrives at Tara, just about to light the fire, and what happens? But he's upstaged. So Patrick is summoned by the furious High King. Then there's a big magic contest where the High King's Druids do things like making snow, and Patrick's monks melt it, and that's okay. The High King's magicians do something else, and so on. They go back and forth until finally they get worse and worse, just like the plagues of Egypt, which enabled Pharaoh to be so angry he wanted the Israelites to go, because now all the firstborn sons of all the nobility had been killed in Egypt. So the High King gives and agrees to become Christian. So it's rather clever the way that Mirshu puts it, and it's sort of, you can tell it's for an ecclesiastical audience. Your average country bumpkin wouldn't get any of this. So it is really trying to put Armagh on the map, because Patrick is much more powerful than the High King, and he is the one who converts Ireland in a night. So, just as the Israelites were delivered from their slavery to the Egyptians in a single night, and as Jesus freed the waiting dead, waiting in the underworld, through his resurrection on Easter night, so his servant Patrick, the first Bishop of Armagh, delivered Ireland from paganism through celebrating the Easter Vigil and lighting the Paschal fire. So that is all we know, really, about Patrick. So, any questions? Yes?
It may be an elementary question of mine, but in what language are the works attributed to St. Patrick chiefly written?
Oh, they're all written in Latin.
Yeah.
All the books in those days were written by Latin, because you see, all of the Roman Empire spoke Latin, so Latin was a normal language. The only thing is they used rather old texts. They used a rather old Latin translation, so some of their quotations are from early versions of the scriptures, but they're all in Latin. And this is very definitely Patrick's Confessions, and the letter too is Patrick. It's just Mirku where we get all this sort of theology, as opposed to Patrick's feelings, that we can immediately begin to smell a possible rat. Yes?
Where do we get the snakes from?
The snakes from? Yes. Well, it's interesting that there's a similar story about the snakes. St Hilda turned the snakes around Whitby into stone, and sometimes it's an explanation for the fossils, the ammonites, how could they have been turned to, what are these things? Oh, it must be snakes that were turned to stone. Now, why would we want to, and who could? Who could? Well, it must be a holy man that's turned to stone. Let's find a holy man. Or a holy woman in the case of Hilda. So it's arguing backwards from what you'd find that you can't find a reason for.
Where is the first suggestion that he drove the snakes out of Ireland? Where do we get that from?
There are some much later lives of Patrick that I haven't bothered to talk about with you, which are mostly accounts of made up there, sort of miraculous. Because lives of saints were totally different in those times. They didn't have a sense of history like us. It wasn't to tell an accurate story. These were edifying sermons to use on the liturgy of the saint's feast day. So you needed a number of edifying, preferably miraculous stories in Matins, Vespers, the Eucharist on their feast day. So that's what they were compiled as. And so most of it isn't true. And they're all very standard. And so they borrowed each other's lives. They just changed the names of the saints in them. Which makes it very complicated for the the people who study the saints' lives, the hagiographers, it's a very important and fascinating Miss Marple's type study that is really very specialised discipline now. Karen Yankulak is one of the finest of the Miss Marples of this whole area. She works at Lampeter and she's published books on decoding various saints' lives. But it's coming from a later level of hagiography. Yes?
Was the Paschal fire already a common part of Christianity? He didn't just borrow it from the Jewish druids.
Oh, the Paschal fire was absolutely crucial. And you've got to combine it with the fact that every community, every village, every fortress had a communal hearth only, which was all, and if it was a Christian country, that was extinguished and a new one lit. It's got to be the new fire of Easter. And so, yeah, keeping a fire alight was a crucial thing. And yeah, the Easter fire was there from early Christian times. And all those blessings of the fire in the Carmina Gadelica, for example, the Scottish people in the Western Isles, how you heaped in turf. And Abraham and Isaac, they've got to carry the fire with them, a sod, really, to go and light a fire to offer Isaac. So keeping a fire and lighting a fire were hugely important sacred actions. Yeah. Yes?
What about the text we know as Patrick's breastplate?
Patrick's breastplate. Yes. There are quite a lot of poems in the genre. They're called lorica or breastplates. Lots of them were written mostly anonymously, but then another problem is that if you wrote something and you wanted it to survive for a few decades, you would give it an attribution to someone famous. And all these lorica are actually derived from the concept in St. Paul's letters about putting on the armour of Christ. It is possible, but it is rather unlikely that most of the Celtic poetry that survives is written by either Columba or Patrick. There's one possible one that Columba might well have written, though quite a few will have emerged from the Iona tradition. But in the case of Patrick, he is simply so early that there are absolutely no records and there's no way of verifying anything. So in other words, we've got huge, huge gaps in our knowledge. The earlier we go, and when we go to the 5th, 6th century, it's mostly gaps. When we're getting into the 7th, 8th century, the gaps are slowly being filled. By about the 10th century, we've got more writings surviving. But until then, really, there's lots and lots of guesses that we have to make. Is it time? Yeah?
Elizabeth, I'm wrestling with how to phrase this question. Being Celt, did the Celts, Celtish Christians, do anything different with the basic Christian message than, say, the Romano?
That's a very important question. I'm so glad you've asked it. Yes, Celtic just refers to a language group. So the Galatians spoke a Celtic language. The Celts were from East Asia Minor right across. And so it's just the name of a language group. So no, they didn't do anything different. But, having said that, each region had its own style of worship and of praying and its own regional dialect of music, of everything. Because there was nothing sort of, they didn't value uniformity and nor was it possible. So there were different styles and schools of chant and well, as in England, the Sarum liturgy, the Sarum Rite based in Salisbury, and the other ones, they all had sort of regional differences, but a lot in common. And what they had in common was the scriptures and the sort of handing on of holiness and of chanting the psalms and the Eucharist. So, and it wasn't seen as a value, uniformity. And again, like I was saying, you choose which monastery suits your temperament, and that's where you go. Yes?
It strikes me that there's a wonderful collection of female Celtic saints that don't seem to have as large a grouping in the Romano-Christian. Why is that?
Right, there are a number of reasons. One is loads and loads of saints are in Ireland, and Irish inheritance laws meant that when a male died, e.g. an abbot, the monastery remained in the could be handed on to his nephew. When a female died, the property reverted back to the family, and so the monastery dissolved. So monasteries had to start from scratch again if they were female-only monasteries. Another problem is that subsequently the churches were quite patriarchal, and women were seen much more as slaves in that culture, and so it was a lot harder to get out of all that. You only could if you were high-born for a start, and so get free of serfdom to become a holy woman, so that, let's say, there are roughly 100 surviving lives of Irish male saints. There are only 4 surviving lives of female saints: Bridget, Eacher, Santhan, and one. And the same in Wales. In Wales, at the Reformation, there was something like, if I'm saying like 200 men's monasteries, there were 3 women's communities, of which one had 15 nuns and one had 16 and one had 3. So it was a lot more countercultural, hugely more countercultural for women to be religious. And the same with the desert fathers and mothers. A lot fewer of the women went out to the desert. Well, partly because you had to be very tough to survive the rigours, and partly the whole cultural thing. So a combination of all those. Have I still got time, or do you want me to stop?
I think it's 1:30. We ought to. It's very difficult because you seem to be in full flood. Fantastic. Can I just say thank you so much. It was a wonderful beginning to the series. Very good overview and wonderful to hear what there is to know about Patrick. Thank you so much. If any of you can contribute towards the cost of these talks, we'd be most grateful. And if you'd like to look at Elizabeth's books here, they're all by there. I have got this one, and I know it's excellent, with her own photographs in it, Cultic saints and their landscape. But they're excellent books, so please have a look. And next week we have Michelle Brown coming up from Land's End, no less. And she will be doing a presentation on the Lindisfarne Gospels. And while I'm on the Lindisfarne Gospels, these wonderful blinds, which you can't really see at the moment, but you will next week because we need to be in the dark. I want to thank several of you here who made that possible. Thank you for your generosity. And thank you for your generosity for coming all the way up from Somerton.